Can we really trust the Gospels as reliable? Do the Gospel writers embellish facts, or do they get locations, customs, and cultural details right? Do the Gospels hopelessly contradict, or do they offer genuine testimony from people in a position to know about Jesus? Well, our guest today, Dr. Lydia McGrew, first time on the channel, has written an excellent, and I mean excellent, new book, defending the Gospels, called Testimonies to the Truth. We're going to look at 7 pieces of evidence that you lay out. One by one, Lydia takes some questions and challenges to them for the trustworthiness of the Gospels, and then take your questions, the audience, live. Lydia, you ready to rock and roll?
I'm ready, Sean. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a treat. Now, some folks might be wondering, why are you laying down? You just have some back challenges. And so being in some pain, your willingness to come and do this nonetheless is awesome. So thanks for doing it. Really looking forward to this. Now, we're going to get to your book, Testimonies to the Truth, but a question I've never asked you before, and I'm really curious to hear. Why are you a Christian? And does this evidence we're going to walk through in any way play into why you are a Christ follower?
Yeah, it does. I became a Christ follower when I was really young, when I was a really young child. And of course, at that time, I hadn't had the opportunity to know about this evidence. But it's been a long time since then. And there have been all kinds of things, doubts that have arisen in my mind, and knowledge of alternate viewpoints. And if it were not for my confidence in the reliability of the Gospels now, I question whether I would currently have continued to be a Christ follower all this time.
Oh, that's really fair. I appreciate you clarifying that. Now, what makes your approach to defending the Gospels in this book unique or different than, say, other approaches people take?
Well, I would say that I bring together some things that nobody else who is at least currently alive out
Hmm.
there is bringing together. So I've got my background in probability theory and epistemology. I've got my interest and my research into the Gospels, and what I'm trying to do is put those two together. The little phrase for my YouTube channel is making common sense rigorous, and so that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to pitch this to a lay audience. I think it's a very lay friendly book, but with an awareness in the background of critical scholarly challenges to the Gospels, but carrying that very lightly. And then what I'm trying to do is teach people to recognize what I call the texture of testimony. And as
Mm.
far as I know, I'm the only person out there, and this is the only book out there that brings all those different types of backgrounds together and then presents them in this way.
There's some similarities, I would say, with Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. Of course, you're a philosopher, that's your training. He brings in kind of a forensic science background. But this sense of like, what does genuine testimony look like? What feel does it have? How do we know when somebody's inventing something versus reporting what they believe to be true? That's really the unique approach that you take. Now, that's a piece of it. You talk about what are internal and external evidence. What's the difference between those? And then we're going to jump into the specific evidence that you lay out.
Generally, the word external is used in biblical studies when we're bringing in something from outside, whether it be geography, another historian, that kind of thing, an inscription, something like that, that fits together with something found within the canon of scripture. And then internal are usually evidences that one way and another come from within the canonical books. So in a way, it's just a way of keeping housekeeping, keeping things organized. They're not really radically different kinds of evidence, but they're categorized in that way.
Yeah, that's a helpful, simple way to put it. And I noticed the first 2, you talk about locations we're about to jump into, and then customs and culture. Those are external, kind of extrinsic evidences. And then the other 5 are all internal. So I think this will help frame it for folks as we jump in. So let's jump in and look at each one of these, and then we'll take some questions. The first one, you say locations. What do you mean by locations, and how does this help establish gospel reliability?
So what I'm connecting there is anything that has to do with place. So this might be place names, it might be distances, it might be the geographical shape or form of the land. Do you go up? Do you go down? And it might be even, I go as far as rulers who ruled particular places at the time. So that's just kind of how I'm putting all of that together in the first chapter that I call location, location, location.
Okay, that makes sense. In terms of place, whether people
Mhm.
or events or insignia that we find, we're talking about location, physical space.
Mhm.
Now, one of the
Mhm.
examples you give, which is one that I often use in kind of a popular apologetics to say like high school students, is this example in Luke chapter 3, verses 1 through 2. And I'll make the point to students that Luke is not just placing this in some distant land in a, that happens in a land far, far away. He gives us all these particular people and places and times, which minimally to me shows such confidence that Luke thinks this is actually true. Explain to us what you draw out of that example in Luke chapter 3.
So what he does is he's talking about all these rulers. And yes, a couple of them are pretty famous, like Tiberius Caesar,
Mm-hmm.
but some of them are a lot more obscure. And so he's doing this kind of what you might call sort of a Venn diagram to zero in on exactly the time when John the Baptist's ministry began. Because after all of these sort of prepositional phrases in the year when this guy was ruling, the word of God came to John, the son of
Mm-hmm.
Zechariah in the wilderness. So he's locating the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry. Um, and he gets into these obscure places like Philip was the ruler of Trachonitis. So this would be Philip, the brother of Herod Antipas. They're both sons of Herod the Great. And like, where's Trachonitis? But we actually have confirmation from Josephus that Philip was in fact the tetrarch of Trachonitis. Or Lysanias was the ruler of Abilene. And I kind of go into a little background, which I won't do in detail here, but how we didn't even know that there was someone named Lysanias at that one particular time who was the ruler of Abilene, and it almost seemed for a while like Luke got the someone who would already have been dead by then, and then we found an obscure inscription in Syria that showed that there was another guy named Lysanias who actually was the ruler of Abilene at that time. So this is bringing together all these different things. It's not just like, Spider-Man is set in New York City. It's actually much more obscure facts that he's putting all together.
So you're moving up my list of favorite guests simply for mentioning Spider Man, but I digress. We'll come back to that. But you're kind of raising this objection that even fictional stories can invent places, like Spider Man took place in New York City, and that doesn't tell us the story's any more true. So, why does these details right help us know that it might be true? And why couldn't the gospel writers just invent this stuff like other fictional writers do?
Well, for one thing, these are really hard things to get right. And you'll notice that several of the things that I was talking about there, some of them maybe you could read somewhere, um, but others you couldn't. So, for example, Lysanias and Abilene, we don't actually know that there was any written history at the time that even mentioned this. We only found it out on this little inscription on a street somewhere that we dug up. So it's important to remember and not be anachronistic that they could not Google these things. There was no Wikipedia. They couldn't even go to a library and get an atlas or something, and go, do you go downhill or uphill when you're going from Cana to Capernaum, and that kind of thing. Um, and certainly it's likely that many of their readers wouldn't have had a way to check up on that. So it's actually a lot harder than is often acknowledged to invent these
Hmm.
kinds of things. And we also don't find that kind of specificity with obscure details in fiction of the kind of the time. I mean, there is fiction. at the time, but it's not of this meticulous variety, this meticulous researched variety. So those are just a couple of the ways to get into that issue of external confirmations and why they're not the kind of thing that the authors would have easily been able to just invent, or even would have thought of inventing to bring in and give verisimilitude to their stories.
Okay, so in your mind, is this positive evidence for the Gospels? Like, I could imagine somebody saying, if somebody gets wrong a detail about a location, then they're not reliable. But if they get it right, is that a kind of positive evidence for the case as well? If so, how?
Well, it actually has to work that way. I mean, in probability theory, if getting it wrong is evidence against, then getting it right has to be evidence for. I
Hmm.
mean, that's just like I could give you the math. I mean, it can't literally be no evidence for. Also, and you can't get asymmetries where something is much stronger evidence in one direction than the other. I would argue that the asymmetry actually goes the opposite way, because it's actually pretty easy to be truthful and not to be embellishing and so forth, and to get things wrong by accident. We actually know what kind of accidental errors that truthful people make. It's actually harder to get things right. So, if
Hmm.
anything, getting them right should be more evidence than getting something really little wrong should be evidence against. But it has to be evidence in both directions to some degree. And that's just like a necessary truth, actually.
That's why we need philosophers to weigh into these questions as well. Super helpful. Now, again, those of you who are going, wait a minute, I don't know all the locations she's talking about. You have a chapter, you go into specific examples, how you think you corroborate it. Luke 3 is one example of this. Let's move to number 2, is where you talk about customs and cultures. So I could obviously guess, and I've read your book, but what do you mean by customs and cultures, and what does this tell us about the gospel writers?
So, what it shows is that they're just really deeply embedded in a highly specific culture that was it was kind of a narrow period of time when Israel was under the rulership of Rome, when Pilate was the procurator and that kind of thing, right there during the 30s, the 20s and 30s AD, very specific the way that those cultures sort of, intersected. That you're not going to find outside of that narrow time frame. And of course, after 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed, that whole delicate interplay of Roman and Jewish rule and customs was pretty much gone. It was a completely
Hmm.
new situation. So this shows an embedding in a highly specific time period that is very difficult to fake.
So you've got a bunch in your book that you walk through, but maybe one or two of your favorites that you just thought were fascinating and telling and somehow supported the Gospels.
So I'll give one that is one of my favorites. That's pretty quick to tell. We find in Luke chapter 9 that
Hmm.
Jesus is going to Jerusalem. He sets his face, it says, to go to Jerusalem. Now, I make an independent argument in comparison with John that I think this was at the time of a festival,
Hmm.
probably the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall, before he died. Then he died the next spring. And the Samaritans won't let him, rent a hotel room, as it were. He sends his disciples ahead to try to find him a place to stay as he's heading to Jerusalem. And it just says they wouldn't allow him to come because his face was set to go toward Jerusalem. And Luke doesn't explain like what that has to do with it. It's not even clear if Luke knows what that has to do with it, but apparently this is what his source told him, that because he was going toward Jerusalem, they wouldn't let him come through their village. And we go and we read Josephus, and we find that the Samaritans just
Hmm.
hated for the Jewish pilgrims to come through their land at the time of the festivals. There were thousands and thousands of them, and they did not appreciate the tourist trade. In fact, sometimes there were actual fights that broke out with people actually getting killed.
Hmm.
And so, if Jesus is actually coming through at the time of a festival, and there's just been this huge influx of pilgrims already coming through, he comes through, and they're like, "That's it, we're done. We don't want you. Go somewhere else. Leave us alone. We don't want you to come through." And so that's apparently what is going on there in Luke 9, but it you only realize that when you know that background about the Jews and the Samaritans. So I really like that one.
That is really, really interesting. So let me ask you this. We've looked at two kind of external evidences from locations, customs, and cultures. You deal with some of the toughest ones in your book. This is not a book where you kind of shy away from the controversial ones. As you were writing this, were there certain archaeological discoveries or customs that you're like, I'm not sure what to do with this, that gave you pause? How many difficult ones would you compare with the positive ones that you found looking at the Gospels through this lens?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there are certain favorites that, as you know, skeptics will dive into, like the census, right? I mean, you can't talk about the reliability of Luke without someone bringing up the census in Luke 2 at the time of Jesus' birth. And you can go out there, you can go to my YouTube channel and my audio podcast. I have a whole series on the census. So, that one takes a lot more time to unpack. But I
Okay.
would say it's far outweighed the few that are sticky, as it were, external things where you're like, how does that really fit? Are far outweighed by
Hmm.
the sheer number, not only quantity, but also quality of external confirmations, very lovely, subtle external confirmations of the content of the Gospels.
That's fair. So in your mind, quantitatively, the number that fit and even qualitatively is so much greater, even though there's a few for which we have questions about and take much more time to unpack.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would say.
okay, that's totally fair. All right, so we've looked at two external confirmations for the Gospels. We're going to look at five internal ones. And I think this is where some of your work, I think, is particularly unique because a lot of other people have talked about locations and archaeology and customs. In the way you do, I think, is fresh. But these five, I think, make a really unique case. So let's jump into them. And the first one, you've written an entire book on this. And so I would point people to that book, not only this one, but you have this idea of what's called an undesigned coincidence. What is that, and what would an undesigned coincidence reveal potentially about the reliability of the Gospels?
So I like to call an undesigned coincidence an incidental interlocking that points to truth. I didn't think of that before I wrote my earlier book. So the definition there is a little more awkward, but
Hmm.
I think that puts it in a pretty punchy way. You have two different uh, sources, often about the same event. And one will give one part of the story, and another will give another part of the story. And then you can see them fit together. And in the classic kind, it's kind of a cause and effect thing. So I often find that the most effective way to illustrate an undesigned coincidence is to give a made up modern example. If, for example, you had two alleged witnesses to a robbery, and one of them was describing the robber's clothes and happened to mention that his shoe was untied,
Hmm.
then you go talk to the other alleged witness, and that guy's describing what the robber did and says, and when he ran out, he tripped and he almost fell.
Hmm.
That's an undesigned coincidence because they don't mention, each of them does not mention what the other one mentions, but the untied shoe explains the near fall. So we find that in the Gospels, and I think you can just see immediately with that example of the robber how that confirms truthfulness because it's what the older authors called artless. Neither of them appears to be trying to fit it together, and yet it does fit together because reality fits together.
Gotcha. Now, give us an example of, say, one of your favorite ones that you think is just most interesting. Either favorite because you think it's strongest or just kind of one of the most interesting, surprising, undesigned coincidences.
Well, here's one, everybody has their favorites. And so to keep it fresh, I sometimes do a different one in every interview. So here's one I don't think I've done recently in an interview.
Okay.
In the book of Luke, you have the Gospel of Luke. He's telling about the Last Supper. And the the disciples get to arguing over who will be the greatest. Jesus starts rebuking them, and he says, "Who is greater? The one who reclines at the table," which is how they ate, they reclined, "or the one who serves? Is it not the one who
Hmm.
reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves." Now, we are so used to sermons on how Jesus is a servant, blah, 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 that we don't realize that, he hasn't done anything particularly servant like in the Gospel of Luke. Like, if you read up to that point and even through that point, it's like, what exactly is servant like about Jesus here? And he apparently is reclining. It even says he's reclining at the table with them. So why does he say it's the one who serves rather than the one who's reclining? But I'm as the one who serves. That even seems to contradict, internally when he is right there at the table with them. But if you go over to John, John describes how Jesus gets up from the table and
Hmm.
pours the water and washes their feet, which was definitely something a slave, not even a higher servant. Richard Balcom emphasizes that. To wash the feet was the work of a slave. And like that fits perfectly. What does he mean when he says, "Who's greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves?" I'm among you as the one who serves, because he has actually gotten up from reclining at the table
Hmm.
and has washed their feet. But Luke never mentions the foot washing, and John never mentions the quarrel or this rebuke that Jesus makes. So those two fit together in a really beautiful way.
Now, you give a few in this book, dozens in your other book, but the idea is that this shows their independent testimony confirming the same event in different ways. Is that the heart of what follows from undesigned coincidences?
Right, and sometimes it's not always the same event, and yet it's
Mm.
confirming a sort of a set of facts that fit together. Um, so, for example, Matthew mentions that Herod was speaking to his servants, and we don't know at a certain point, and we don't know how Matthew could have known that he was speaking to his servants. Like, did Matthew maybe just make that up? And then we find over in Luke, completely different context, that the wife of Herod's household manager, Joanna, was actually a follower of Jesus. So even though they're not talking about the same event, they fit together because that tells us um, how Matthew could have known what Herod was saying to his servants. So it's like a set of facts. It's reality, and they're giving us different jigsaw puzzle uh, pieces of that reality that then fits together to form a unified picture.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Let's move to number 4, what you call unnecessary details. So, what do you mean specifically by unnecessary details, and why do you think they're a mark of truth?
Well, unnecessary details are things that are not required at all for the story. So, for example, Mark mentions that when Jesus was asleep in the boat, right before he stills the storm, he's sleeping on a cushion. Like, you don't need to know that he's sleeping on a cushion, right? Or John mentions that when they saw Jesus on the shore after he was raised from the dead, and Peter's going to go jump into the water and swim to the shore, he puts on his coat. And that's kind of weird anyway. Like, why would you put on your coat before jumping into the water? Okay,
Hmm.
so that's not necessary. Even if you just want to tell about Peter jumping in and trying to get to Jesus as fast as possible, you don't need to mention that he put on his coat. So that's kind of what I mean, that it doesn't really further the story, and yet it tells us more about the story, more about what happened. I think that this is a mark of truth because it's the kind of thing that we actually see, that witnesses do remember. That when they're telling something, people remember these little inconsequential things. He picked me up in his car, and it was a Lincoln Continental. Like, I have an exact example of that, a real life example of that in
Hmm.
the book, because things just kind of jump out to you and stick in your mind, these weird random things. And so that's why I think it is a mark of truth.
Okay, so this is an important distinction because your point is to say the Gospels read like people who saw and experienced or investigated these events. So these are hints that it's not just being made up, but reads like genuine testimony. Hence, you point to a common sense example like picking up or noticing a car. That's the heart of what you're arguing for, right?
Right, right. And it's important because even if a liar makes up something, the liar's sort of acknowledging that that has verisimilitude. It's sort of like the tribute that vice plays to virtue, as it were. Why would a liar bother to make up unnecessary details if he didn't realize that actually that is something that gives verisimilitude
Mm.
to a narrative, in a sense.
That is really interesting. So the idea that a liar would make up certain details to try to make it seem truthful tells us that such details are a sign of truthfulness when we see them.
Yep.
So if that's the case, then both liars and those who are telling the truth would have those details. So how do we know in some cases somebody is telling the truth and they're not just lying to include these unnecessary details?
Right, and that's an excellent question. I talk about something in the book called the Goldilocks zone. Goldilocks is and the one porridge was too hot and the other was too cold. Baby Bear's porridge was just right. So the gospel details fall into what I call the Goldilocks zone. So they're not overdone. They're not like this huge welter in one story. We're just throwing it all in. Um, it'll pop out just like it does in memoir, one little detail that you happen to remember, and then you get on with your story. Um, but they are really vivid and they are really odd, like that one about Peter putting on his coat. That's not the kind of thing that I think a liar would make up because it's an odd detail that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so when you start to recognize this Goldilocks zone of detail, it doesn't sound like a liar. It doesn't sound like ancient fiction. It doesn't sound like modern fiction. It sounds like memoir. Like if you sit down with your father and you ask him, what were things like in the Iraq War or something like that, and he tells you, you'll notice this level where something will pop out. So, for example, in the raising of Lazarus, it says Jesus was moved in spirit, and that uh, is the word that means to snort. It's like, "Ugh," he's angry, and we don't even know exactly why. But it kind of jumps out. But then it goes back to just describing the story. So, for example, Martha has worried that Lazarus might stink, but John doesn't tell us whether he stinks or not. It's not like if someone's just elaborating the story, they're going to be like, oh, and he opened up the grave and it really smelled horrible. John's not doing that. But just that little thing about Jesus being moved and making this sound, it it pops out, and then we go back to a briefer narrative.
Hmm. Okay. So let me ask you this. This might be outside of your just what you've studied or aware of. Somebody made a comment, well, Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon also gave a lot of details. Are you aware of somebody applying this rigor to, say, the Book of Mormon, or have you looked at it through this lens to draw out a comparison between how it reads with the Gospels?
I have not done the Book of Mormon specifically, so I'd have to see what he does. Um, could he be describing a partially true event and then, adding something else to it? But I think it's important to realize that we have four different gospels here by four different authors, sometimes even describing the same event, as in the case of the feeding of the 5,000. And you get this texture of witness testimony in different ways, in different passages, all through these four different gospels, even though the details are often different, and showing that kind of independence. And so obviously, this isn't just going with one person who had a motive to make something up and just writing it all in that one person's version, as in the case of the Book of Mormon.
That's a fair distinction. All right, let's look at two more that you have here, and then we'll have some time for some questions. Actually, three more that we have here. Number 5 was unexplained allusions. What do you mean by an unexplained allusion, and why do you consider them a piece of evidence for the truth of the Gospels?
So, an unexplained allusion is something that really looks like bad fiction. And this is also part of my answer to some of the earlier questions that have arisen. An unexplained allusion makes you stop. It makes you say, wait, what's that all about? And the author doesn't bother to answer that natural question that would arise in the person's mind, a reader's or a hearer's mind. What that tells me is that the author doesn't have his eye on the audience all the time. And I think a liar or a just a person who's even writing ordinary fiction and admitting that it's fiction, he has his eye more on the audience than what you find in an unexplained allusion. And so therefore it is evidence of what I call artlessness and what the
Hmm.
older authors called artlessness.
Now, I'm going to ask you for one of your favorite examples. Somebody made a comment and said, why is Lydia lying down? It's because she's had some health challenges with her back. And so it's painful in some ways to even do this interview. So we're grateful that you're here and you're willing to take these questions nonetheless. So that's to give you some context if you joined late and maybe missed the beginning. So maybe give us an example, your favorite example or one that jumps out about what you mean by an unexplained illusion.
So, one of my favorite examples occurs in John chapter 3. And it says that the disciples of John the Baptist were having a dispute with a Jew about purification. But it doesn't tell us what was the dispute about, what was going on. And then they come to their rabbi, John the Baptist, and they complain about the popularity of Jesus and a baptizing ministry that Jesus and his disciples were having at that time. And they say he's baptizing and everybody's coming to him. So they're jealous, obviously. And first of all, they don't explain what that has to do with the dispute that they were having. We're left to guess what that had to do with it. And then when John the Baptist answers them, he doesn't explain what this has to do with the dispute. He doesn't, settle the dispute in what is reported in John. Probably he did in what actually happened. But this dispute and what it has to do with the narrative is just dropped. And I think if you are self-consciously trying to write a smooth fictional narrative, you're not going to do that. You're not just going to let weird things drop like that and not worry about the impact on your audience. But as John the evangelist is telling it, he just wants to kind of get on. He wants to get on to what John the Baptist said because John the Baptist says he must increase and I must decrease. That's what he's interested in. But I think that that is an argument for the reality of this dispute, this argument that they had about purification, that he remembers it, he knows that it's what prompted this dialogue between John the Baptist and his disciples, but he doesn't bother to tell you what it's about. He doesn't really care if his audience is curious and uninformed or if that's a little bit awkward. He doesn't stop to smooth that out. And that's just one example of many.
We give quite a few that are interesting, but I think it makes the point of the power of an unexplained illusion for at least the writers writing in a way that we normally write when we're reporting events that we've seen and we've experienced and we're eyewitnesses of. There's two more here. Now, there were some questions that came up earlier. What about contradictions, etc.? This is where you kind of weigh into that topic here. Number 6, you call it unexpected harmonies. Tell us what you mean by that and why you think they provide evidence for the Gospels.
So I do. I get into that issue of alleged contradictions. And I talk about what I call reconcilable variation. That when you have truthful witnesses, they're not all going to say the same thing, even when they're all talking about the same event. And in fact, you will get apparent discrepancies. Sometimes you'll even get real discrepancies, but you'll for sure get apparent discrepancies. Obviously, if it's a real discrepancy, somebody's wrong about something, usually on relatively small matters. But these apparent discrepancies are part of what I call that texture, that witness texture, that reality of that texture. And you mentioned J. Warner Wallace. He talks about that too in Cold Case Christianity. That when you have too much agreement, it's suspicious, it's weird. It almost looks like they're basing it on one another. And the interesting thing is that you'll find scholars who will say, particularly with the first 3 Gospels known as the Synoptics, that they are basing it on one another. And yet then they'll turn around and they'll say, and here's this irresolvable contradiction. Well, pick a narrative, okay? If they're basing it on one another, why couldn't they avoid these discrepancies? It would, or even
Hmm.
apparent discrepancies. It would seem that that would be pretty easy to do. And so that's one way in which they help. And then the other way is that when we activate our real world imagination, we often find that just as in the real world, apparent discrepancies are resolvable in ways that aren't really far fetched, and that
Hmm.
that's not a religious exercise, that's a natural and legitimate historical exercise.
Okay, so for this one, I was tempted to just ask you your favorite, but I've got to ask you one that comes up a lot. There's a lot of debate amongst this within Christians and those who are not Christians about the question of where Jesus first appeared to his male disciples after the resurrection. Was it in Galilee or is it in Jerusalem? Because at least minimally there seems to be a tension here.
Right, and the reason that it's said to be attention to some extent, in my opinion, is because of the argument from silence. And biblical scholars, New Testament scholars, are really subject to a faulty use of the argument from silence. So, for example, Matthew goes straight to talking about them going to Galilee to meet Jesus. He doesn't mention any meeting in Jerusalem, but he doesn't say that they didn't meet Jesus in Jerusalem. Okay, so he's
Hmm.
obviously interested in the meeting in Galilee, but it doesn't follow that he's denying a meeting in Jerusalem. So that's something to realize right away, is that to use an argument from silence against testimony is a very poor use. So that's part of it. Um, and we find that John acts as an interesting sort of bridge between Matthew and Luke. So Matthew narrates only a meeting in Galilee, Luke narrates only a meeting in Jerusalem. And I,
Mm-hmm.
I think they're clearly different meetings, partly from the fact that they're in different places, but also the details of them are quite different. Um, and then John tells us that Jesus and his male disciples met at first in Jerusalem, and then that
Mm-hmm.
later they did go to Galilee and met in Galilee. This appears to be a different meeting in Galilee from the one that Matthew gives, but
Right.
it's an interesting way in which I think John actually helps to harmonize the synoptics. That we get, in a sense, multiple attestation when we talk about John for both their being in Jerusalem and meeting Jesus there, and for their being in Galilee and meeting Jesus there. So when we allow our natural historical imaginations to work, and we allow John to help to inform our reading of the synoptics, we actually see that it all fits together really well.
All right, now you used a word that I'm sure for some people are like, here we go, Christians just making stuff up. You said historical imagination. Tell me what you mean by that and why you think it's appropriate to approach these discrepancies using our imaginations.
So I'm going to give an example from my own life. My church sadly is closing right now, and I'm involved in helping with the closing. If I said to someone recently, "Yeah, my church is closed," okay, and then I said to someone else, "Well, my church is closing right now, and I'm helping with disposing of its assets." Okay? Um, you could put those together and you could say, "Well, is it closed or is it closing?" Right?
Hmm.
And if you use a little imagination, you can say, "Well, it's closed in the sense that you're not having meetings anymore, but it's not dissolved yet. You still have assets, and it takes some time to dispose of that. You don't just do that overnight." And so that's how it's closed versus it's closing are reconciled. And using imagination to reconcile those by talking about the fact that it takes a while to dissolve a nonprofit is a completely legitimate thing and is, in fact, true. That is actually the true reason why, in some contexts, I'll say my church is closed, and in other contexts, I'll say my church is closing. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's a completely secular example of how using imagination can help us to see how both things are true at the same time.
It really is interesting to think about this because my church not long ago moved to another location for about 2 years as their buildings were completely refurbished. And I easily could have said to somebody, hey, the church is closed. But what do I mean? Is it 6 p.m. it's closed? Well, yeah, it's closed that night, but it's still open for people to come to, not just at that moment. And of course, there could be a contradiction there. But before concluding that, we would have to look at when do you mean, what do you mean? And sometimes that extra work is not done. And the difficulty with the Gospels is sometimes we don't have access to some of the details to unpack it more because it's 2,000 years removed. But for me, I think the fact that you're a philosopher, and I have a master's in philosophy, but I know you've done doctoral work in philosophy, right?
Uh,
Or
no, I broke into the
okay,
philosophy era by publishing. So
okay,
it's entirely blind peer-reviewed articles by which I have actually broken into it. My doctoral work was in English, actually, but
okay, that's right.
I have like a 20-year and more of publications, and that's where my philosophy work comes in.
Gotcha. Well, you certainly approach things philosophically, and a contradiction is when we affirm and deny the same thing at the same time in the same way. And your point about harmonization is yes, there's tensions, there's details that are left out. Sometimes we don't know the whole story. But if there's a possible way that these can be reconciled, at least that removes the sting that there's a direct contradiction. And I think that's reasonable and a charitable way we should approach any books, even if it's another spiritual book that you and I don't agree with, such as the Book of Mormon. We should approach it that fashion. And I think that's the heart of what you're getting to. So you're not only saying there's not contradictions there, but there's a certain unexpected harmony that we find. And I think that's really interesting.
Right, we wouldn't expect it to be reconcilable this often, in my opinion. I think it's really striking that we keep testing it again and again, and we often find them reconcilable. Not even just like bare possibility. It's not just even a logical possibility, but things that actually I think make sense once
Mm.
we get rid of that. I sometimes say that New Testament scholars harmonizations like the princess and the pea, like the princess, you put the pea under all of those cushions, and she's like, "Oh, this is terrible. It's a big, lump under my bed." And I think scholars are overly inclined to call something a strained harmonization, which isn't really strained. It actually makes a lot more sense when you are using common sense.
I agree. Well said. Well, let's look at your last one, unified personalities, and then we'll have time for some questions here. So, tell us what you mean by unified personalities, and then maybe give us the example of Peter. I thought this was an interesting one.
So, by unified personalities, I mean that you have different stories about the same person, um, and you can pick out characteristics of his personality, sometimes rather subtle characteristics, and it's clearly the same guy, even though these stories are coming from different books, different authors. That's harder to do than you might think. Even in a
Hmm.
modern context, it's harder to do if you're making them up. So we got four different authors here with four different emphases and perspectives and so forth. And yet the Peter they describe, it's the same Peter all the time. So I can go into that a little bit about Peter. Um, Peter has this interesting quality of being lovingly argumentative. So he argues, he argues constantly. Okay, he's like that kid who always has his hand up in class. I think we all know, that kid. Okay, and he talks too much. He over promises. He'll say, "No, no, no, I'll never desert you, Jesus. I'll never fall away." But he does these things because he loves Jesus and because he has this aspiration, and it's a genuine, sincere aspiration to be a true disciple of Jesus, but he can't live up to it.
Hmm.
So we find him in the synoptics. Jesus says, I'm going to die. I'm going to be crucified. And he's telling them it's straightforward. And Peter has the gall. He literally pulls him aside and he says, Jesus, you're not going to die. No way. No way. That's not going to happen. He's like in denial. And
Hmm.
it's like, don't you think Jesus knows if he's going to die or not? He has a lot of nerve to do that. But it's because he can't accept that. He can't believe that
Mm,
Jesus is going to die. Okay? And then similarly in John, Jesus is going to wash their feet, and he comes to Peter, and Peter's horrified. Like, this is terribly undignified for Jesus to do the work of a slave. You're never going to wash my feet. He says, no, no, no way. And, it's just beneath you to wash my feet. And Jesus says, well, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me. Oh, Peter says, okay, in that case, don't just wash my feet, wash my head and my hands. He can't just shut up and let Jesus do what Jesus is going to do. So that's what I mean by this. It's this weird combination of
mm,
respect and love and argument that is just unique. It's uniquely Peter, and we find it in these subtle ways through all
mm.
four of the Gospels.
You also walk through Mary and Martha. You talk about Thomas, who is
Mhm,
one of my
mhm,
favorite apostles after studying the apostles. People are going to have to read it to find out those, but this idea that there's this common personality that makes sense across the different gospels. Your point is that's hard to make up and invent and reads like somebody is writing the kind of report that they know and have seen and have examined. Love it. Now, I had a couple questions for you. We're going to skip over this for sake of time to make sure we can go to some questions here. But you have a section in the end where you walk through Jesus and talk about these very unique things about the message of Jesus. But one last question before we wrap up. Why does gospel reliability matter to you? Why is this question even important?
It is. It's just overwhelmingly important, and I would say one reason is that we really need to know what Jesus taught. And so, for example, Jesus teaches a lot about the Holy Spirit in the Gospel of John, and our knowledge of the Holy Spirit would be reduced. If we thought that that was
Hmm.
just John's words being put into Jesus' mouth, and we needed to be comforted if we're Christians, and we say, I need to know that Jesus really knows what I'm feeling. Jesus really knows what I'm suffering. We have examples of that in the Gospels, but did they make it up? Did he really cry out and say, "I thirst" when he was on the cross, etc.? And then finally, I think that it's really important because I think it's intimately bound up with our reason for believing that Jesus rose from the dead. I really think that our argument that Jesus rose from the dead, which is a central argument for the truth of Christianity, is gravely weakened if
Hmm.
we grant, even just for the sake of the argument, that the Gospels are unreliable. I
Hmm.
don't think we should grant that even just for the sake of the argument. It's crippling to our argument. So, for all of those reasons, gospel reliability is extremely important. And I
Hmm.
would encourage people just to have a few things that they can say. Okay, you don't have to know it all. You can just have a couple of things in your pocket that you're ready to bring out, and then suggest that people do more research, more reading.
Hmm.
But you don't have to know it all in order to have something to say in a conversation with an unbeliever or a skeptic or somebody. Why do you think the Gospels are reliable?
That's uh, that's great. I love it. Super helpful. Let's take some questions. We have a few minutes left. I appreciate you hanging in here. I know this is uncomfortable, but here's a question I think you'll enjoy. I'm eager to hear what you have to say. From Dylan Clapp says, isn't undesigned coincidence equally explained by the gospel writers relying on the same written sources as opposed to explicitly supporting that they were actually eyewitnesses? So, again, the claim is, can't we explain these undesigned coincidences if they're just borrowing or relying upon the same written record as opposed to be actually eyewitnesses?
Well, no, because there
Hmm.
is no such written record. Um, I
Hmm.
mean, it's a hypothesis completely devoid of evidence. So take the one I gave very briefly earlier about Joanna, the wife of Herod's household manager. There is no written source of which we are aware that we have any information about that both says that Joanna was the wife of Herod's household manager and that she was a follower of Jesus, and that says that Herod said this particular thing to his servants. That's not found in any one written source that we have. So when we start making up a written source that, by golly, it's such a coincidence, looks just like reality, and we're putting it in the place of reality, then it becomes sort of similar to a deceiver hypothesis in philosophy. Like,
Okay.
there is no real external world, but there's this world that exists in the mind of a deceiver that, wouldn't you know, just happens to look just like the real world. And I find that people do this with a completely hypothetical written source from which they might be dismantling and taking little bits and pieces when there is no evidence of such a source.
Great response. Super helpful. And again, for those who are like, what do you mean by undesigned coincidence? You've written a whole book, and the title is Hidden in Plain View, right? I want to make sure I got that title right if somebody
Hidden
wants
in
to
plain
go
view.
to that. This book we're talking about, Testimonies to the Truth, you walk through 7 different evidences, 2 external, 5 internal, and undesigned coincidences is one of that. Okay, if you have a question for Dr. McGrew, write in question in caps. We have time for just a handful of these. But I'm curious, you believe the Gospels are reliable, and you set out to defend them, but you also did some fresh research for this book. What surprised you most as you were examining the reliability of the Gospels? Does anything take you back and surprise you one way or another?
Wow, that's a good question. I think I was surprised to find that when I was doing some of these reconcilable variations and researching them, I found certain things that reminded me of undesigned coincidences and that kind of sat at the borderline of undesigned coincidences and reconcilable variations. So I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but just to intrigue people with the book, the thing I mentioned earlier for my reason for thinking that it was the time of the Feast of the Tabernacles when Jesus went to Jerusalem in Luke 9. Um, so that was something I was interested in because of a sort of a little challenge concerning the central section of Luke. I've done a series of it on my YouTube channel. And then realizing how well that fit with John 7 when Jesus was going to travel to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacles. It was like an undesigned coincidence in many ways, but it was also a reconcilable variation. So that was cool to find and surprising to find that there's like always more
Hmm.
that you can discover that maybe you didn't know before.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that surprised me as I was reading it is how many of the evidences you lay out support John as opposed to the synoptics, because the narrative we hear, and of course John is likely written later, is that there's a less of a case for the reliability of John. But even when you walk through locations in John and some of these factors, I was pleasantly surprised at some of the case that you make for John. Did that surprise you? Am I right on with that? How do you see John compared to the synoptics in light of the case that you're making here?
Well, you're completely right. And the meme, I would definitely call it a scholarly meme, that John appears less historical is completely wrong. Now, by the time I got to writing testimonies, it no longer surprised me because I had my previous book was called The Eye of the Beholder and was entirely on the Gospel of John. And I really hope people will get hold of that, The Eye of the Beholder. So by that time, I realized that the very fact that John is different from the synoptics gives him a sort of opportunity to be confirmed even more often because he's telling all this other stuff, and yet it fits together in undesigned coincidences and other connections with the synoptics and with external evidence. The way I like to put this is the more John tells us, the more he is confirmed.
Hmm.
So the more new stuff we get from him, the more new stuff we have a chance to discover is right. And so that those doubts, that shade that sort of gets thrown on John, it's completely wrong.
Hmm. Interesting. Very interesting. Here's a question. Dylan followed up and says, does she totally rule out any version of the Q hypothesis? Now, talk about that, but the section in your book in which you kind of talk about the assumption that if there's similarities between, say, Matthew and Luke, then they must have just copied and not added anything unique to this or had an independent word themselves. You kind of took issue with that.
Yeah,
What are
yeah.
your thoughts?
So, no, I don't rule out the Q hypothesis. Although please remember that that has absolutely nothing to do with John, and it doesn't even have anything to do with Mark. Q material is material that's common to Matthew and Luke.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Q is definitely, even if it's real, it's not going to get you a common written source for these things. It's a conjectural document. I think there might be an earlier version of Matthew that actually stands in the place of Q. So if you go to my YouTube channel, look up synoptic problem. I have one that's actually called "What I Think About the Synoptic Problem," so you can watch it and what I think about the synoptic problem.
Sure.
Um, but I definitely think that scholars overcall the blow when they say if there's any dependence here, there can be no independent factual information. So if Matthew is relying on Mark at all, then any additional material that Matthew has must be made up. That is a huge non sequitur. You can have someone partially relying on something else, and then he also has information in addition that he puts in there. So that detail about Herod speaking to his servants, that's in a passage where Matthew looks a lot like Mark. So scholars would say, maybe rightly, that Matthew has read Mark, his wording owes something to Mark, but to his servants isn't in Mark.
Hmm.
It's not there, it's unique to Matthew. So we have reason then to think, based on that undesigned coincidence, that Matthew had actually been speaking either to Chusa or to his wife Joanna, and therefore had independent access to that scene with Herod. So we need to not make it like either it's totally factually independent or it's totally factually dependent. That's a false dilemma.
Fair enough. And you go into that in some detail again. One more question for you. This is a big one. And for some reason, I don't remember if you addressed this in the book or not. I know you've addressed it elsewhere, but this question comes up a lot in terms of James says, how do you harmonize the two birth narratives? And obviously, James is talking about the different birth narratives in Matthew and in Luke. I think you have extensive videos, if I'm not mistaken, on this, so don't feel the need to go into it. Maybe tell folks where you deal with that on your YouTube channel, and then maybe just give us a couple points of how you approach this.
Right, right, right. I'll try to keep it short. So, yes, go to my YouTube channel. There's a playlist called Virgin Birth. So, Virgin Birth
Hmm.
playlist, but it's all about the infancy and birth narratives. And then, if you want to listen to them, you can look up the individual titles over on the podcast if you just want it in audio. Um, One of the interesting things that in my approach I try to bring out is that when you think about it, I believe there is literally only one apparent discrepancy between Luke and Matthew's birth narratives. And it just
Hmm.
astonishes people. And when we talk about harmonization, presumably we don't just mean that there's stuff that's different in them that could both be true. Presumably we mean there's at least got to be some apparent discrepancy. And there's literally only one, and that has to do with whether they returned immediately to Nazareth after Mary and Jesus went and they offered the turtle doves in the temple, or whether then they had to flee to Egypt. That's literally the only apparent discrepancy. So, one isn't bad, and so I think it's a lot easier to harmonize the birth narratives than is
Hmm.
commonly assumed, and that the discrepancies are exaggerated greatly. I also find, I'll just put this out there to intrigue people, that you actually find a really great subtle agreement between Matthew and Luke in that they both show some connection that Mary and Joseph had in some way, both to Nazareth and to Bethlehem.
Hmm.
So they subtly both indicate those two towns were important to Mary and Joseph in a way that I think can actually help us to understand the background of Jesus' birth even better. So go listen to the playlist if you want to hear more about that.
All right, the playlist is Virgin Birth. Your channel, what's the specific name of your channel?
It's just Lydia McGrew. It's just the
Lydia
Lydia
McGrew.
McGrew YouTube channel, and the same with the Anchor podcast, the Lydia McGrew podcast.
Excellent. Well, there's more questions for you, but I know laying down this is uncomfortable, so I really want to respect your time. Thanks for staying with us for so long. Your book, Testimonies to the Truth, is excellent. I wholeheartedly endorse it. Thanks for giving me a chance to endorse it. I made a mental note that when we update Evidence that Demands a Verdict sometime in the future, we will go back to this and, of course, cite you appropriately, but want to pull from some of the great research that you've done there. So, believer or skeptic, it's a book worth reading, worth engaging, very thoughtful. You've done your homework. Testimonies to the Truth. Check it out. And before you click away, make sure you hit subscribe. We've actually got another live stream this week. I know you think it's crazy. McDowell's going twice live this week on Thursday with a friend, colleague of mine at Biola, Thaddeus Williams, talking about 9 proofs he calls that are really evidences that you are more than matter, that we are body and soul, mind and brain, so to speak. That's going to be fun. We're going to unpack those, take live questions. And if you've thought about studying apologetics, we would love to have you at Biola. We have a fully distance program, and we'd love to train you to become a professional apologist or to even just come study apologetics in your church. If you want to know more about it, I actually did a live stream last Friday with my boss, Craig Hazen, and you just look on this channel, go to the live video before, and we walk through all the things from the cost to the classes to the units. If you're interested, check that out. And there's a link below. You can find out more as well. All right, Lydia, thank you for staying with us for so long. Great job. Again, I hope folks will pick up your book. It's really, really good. There's a lot of thanks here from folks for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean, for having me. It's been fun.